The conference room felt smaller than usual that Tuesday morning. 23 people sat around the oval table, coffee cups steaming, laptops open. I tried to steady my breathing as Derek advanced to the next slide. My name appeared in bold letters at the top, followed by numbers I'd never seen before. Red numbers. Failure metrics. My hands went cold despite the room's warmth. Derek's voice stayed calm, almost sympathetic, as he explained how my project had missed every single target. People shifted in their seats. Some looked at me with what might have been pity. Others just stared at their screens, uncomfortable witnesses to what felt like a public execution. My throat tightened. I wanted to speak, to explain, but the words stuck somewhere between my chest and my mouth. This wasn't right. Those weren't my numbers. But Derek kept talking, kept clicking through slides that painted me as incompetent, careless, someone who couldn't handle responsibility. The glass walls of the conference room suddenly felt like a fishbowl, and I was the one drowning while everyone watched. I tried to focus on his words, but everything sounded distant and muffled. My heart pounded so loud I thought people might hear it. The slide showed completion rates at 32%. I'd submitted 89%. The accuracy scores displayed were catastrophic. Mine had been near perfect. Someone coughed. Another person whispered something to their neighbor. I sat frozen, watching my professional reputation crumble in real time. Derek's presentation was smooth, practiced. He must have rehearsed this. Each slide built on the last, creating a narrative of failure that seemed almost believable. Almost. My stomach twisted into knots. I'd worked 16-hour days on this project, sacrificed weekends, skipped meals, and now I was being told in front of senior leadership that I'd completely failed. The numbers on the screen were lies, but they looked official. They had charts, graphs, color-coded sections, everything that made data seem legitimate. My mouth felt dry. I reached for my water glass and realized my hand was shaking too much to lift it safely. Kelsey, would you like to add anything? Derek's voice cut through my panic. He finally looked at me, eyebrows raised in false concern. I opened my mouth. Nothing came out. Not a sound. My brain screamed with explanations, defenses, evidence. But my voice had abandoned me completely. The silence stretched for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds. Someone cleared their throat. Another person shifted papers. I could feel their discomfort, their second-hand embarrassment for me. Derek nodded slowly, as if my silence proved his point. I understand this is difficult, he said, his tone dripping with manufactured sympathy. Then he moved to the next slide, dismissing me without another word. That's when the truth hit me like ice water. This wasn't about the project. This wasn't about performance or metrics or business outcomes. This was deliberate. This was planned. Derek hadn't made a mistake with those numbers. He'd created them. And I just sat there, silent and defeated, exactly as he'd wanted. My name is Kelsey Patterson, and I work as a data analyst at Brightpoint Solutions, a mid-sized consulting firm in Seattle. I'm 28 years old, and until 3 weeks ago, I thought I understood how the corporate world worked. I believed in merit, in hard work, in doing good work and being recognized for it. I'd been with Brightpoint for almost 4 years. My reviews were always strong. Clients requested me specifically for projects. I wasn't the loudest person in the room, but I was reliable, thorough, someone people could count on to get things done right. Derek Hollins became my team leader 8 months ago when our previous manager retired. He came from a competitor, brought in with promises of innovation and fresh perspective. First, everything seemed fine. He was friendly, approachable, full of ideas about improving workflows and collaboration. But something shifted about 3 months in. Small things at first. Comments in meetings that felt slightly off. Assignments that didn't quite make sense. Nothing I could point to and say definitively was wrong, but enough to create a persistent unease. 3 weeks before that disastrous presentation, Derek stopped by my desk on a Friday afternoon. Most people had already left for the weekend. The office had that quiet, end-of-day feeling. "Kelsey, got a minute?" he asked, leaning against my cubicle wall with his arms crossed. He had this smile that I'd learned to distrust, the one that seemed friendly but never reached his eyes. I saved my work and turned to face him. "Sure, what's up?" "Big opportunity just came across my desk," he said, straightening up. "Client wants a comprehensive market analysis with predictive modeling. High visibility project. Executive team will be watching closely." My pulse quickened. High visibility meant career advancement, the kind of project that got you noticed. "That sounds interesting," I said carefully. "I thought of you immediately," Derek continued. "You've got the technical skills, and I think you're ready for something more challenging. Chance to really prove yourself." The way he emphasized "prove yourself" made my stomach tighten, but I pushed the feeling aside. Maybe I was being paranoid. "What's the timeline?" I asked. Derek pulled up a chair, and that's when I should have known something was wrong. He never sat down for casual conversations. 3 weeks from assignment to final presentation, he said. "I know it's tight, but the client's timeline is non-negotiable." 3 weeks for a comprehensive market analysis was brutal, but not impossible. I'd done rushed projects before. "What's the scope?" I asked, reaching for my notepad. He pulled out his phone and forwarded me an email. "Everything's in there. Market sizing, competitor analysis, trend forecasting, risk assessment. The full package." I scanned the email on my computer. The scope was massive. Easily 6 weeks of work compressed into 3. "This is pretty ambitious for the timeline," I said, trying to keep my tone professional rather than doubtful. "That's why I'm giving it to you," Derek replied. "You're the only one on the team I trust to pull this off." The compliment should have felt good. Instead, it felt like pressure. Like he was setting an impossible standard and waiting for me to fail. The first red flag appeared on Monday morning when I tried to access the client database. Access denied. I needed that data to even begin the market analysis. I sent Derek an email requesting permissions. No response. By Tuesday afternoon I still hadn't heard back, so I sent another email, this time copying the IT department. IT responded within an hour, saying they needed approval from my team leader to grant access. I forwarded their response to Derek. Still nothing. Wednesday morning I walked to his office. He was on a call but waved me in. I waited by the door until he finished. "The database access," I started. "I really need that to move forward. It's been 3 days." Derek frowned, like this was the first he was hearing about it. "Did you submit the request through the proper channels?" "I've sent 3 emails," I said, trying not to sound frustrated. "IT says they need your approval." He sighed and opened his laptop. "Let me look into it. These things take time, Kelsey. You know how bureaucracy works." By the end of week 1, I still didn't have full data access. I'd been granted partial permissions, enough to see surface-level information but nothing detailed enough for meaningful analysis. I worked with what I had, building frameworks and models that I could populate once I got the real data. The project folder sat in our shared drive, and I noticed Derek accessing it multiple times a day. More than seemed necessary for a supervisor just checking progress. He never asked me about it directly, never scheduled check-ins. But I could see in the file logs that he was opening my documents, sometimes late at night. Meanwhile, other projects moved forward smoothly. I watched teammates get approvals for resources within hours. Derek responded to their emails immediately, sometimes within minutes. But my requests went unanswered, or got brief, non-committal responses that didn't actually solve anything. "Still working on that database access," one email said. "These things take time." I started documenting everything. Every email sent, every request made, every conversation we had about the project. Something in my gut told me I'd need evidence later. The pattern became impossible to ignore by week 2. Derek held daily team meetings to discuss ongoing projects. Everyone presented updates except me. "Kelsey's working on something special," he'd say with that smile. "We'll hear about it when it's ready." Sounded supportive, but it isolated me. I couldn't ask for help because I wasn't included in the discussions. I couldn't learn from others' challenges because I wasn't part of the collaboration. One afternoon, I overheard Derek and two teammates talking in the break room. "The client thing is just between us for now," Derek was saying. "Need to keep it confidential until we're ready to present." But it wasn't confidential. He told me it was high visibility, that executives would be watching. Why would he tell others it was secret? I grabbed my coffee and left quickly, my mind spinning. That evening I stayed late and dug through my project files. Something felt wrong, but I couldn't identify exactly what. The scope kept feeling bigger every time I reviewed it. Requirements that seemed clear initially now appeared vague or contradictory. By the start of week 3, I'd built what I could with limited resources. The analysis was solid given the constraints, but it wasn't the comprehensive report Derek had originally described. It couldn't be. I still didn't have access to half the data I needed. Derek finally scheduled a check-in for Tuesday morning. I prepared a presentation showing what I'd completed and clearly outlining what I couldn't finish without proper resources. "This looks thin," he said, barely glancing at my screen. "The client is expecting comprehensive analysis, not surface-level observations." "I've explained the data access issues," I said, pulling up the email chain I'd carefully maintained. "I've sent 14 requests over 3 weeks. He waved his hand dismissively. "You need to be more resourceful, Kelsey. Find alternative sources. That's what separates good analysts from great ones." My jaw tightened. "Alternative sources won't give us the proprietary client data we need for accurate. Make it work," he interrupted. "Deadline is Friday. Final presentation to leadership is next Tuesday." He stood up, conversation over. I sat there for a moment after he left, staring at my incomplete analysis and feeling the trap closing around me. I spent the next 72 hours in what can only be described as controlled panic. I worked until midnight every night, came in at 6 every morning. I found workarounds for everything. Public databases for information that should have come from proprietary sources. Industry reports to supplement missing competitor data. Academic research to support trend predictions. It wasn't ideal, but it was something. I documented every workaround, every limitation, every compromise I'd made because of missing resources. My report included extensive footnotes explaining exactly where data came from and why certain analyses were limited. If this failed, it wouldn't be because I didn't try. It would be because the project was set up to fail. Thursday night, I finished the final draft at 11:30. The report was 97 pages with another 43 pages of appendices and supporting documentation. It wasn't perfect, but given the circumstances, it was remarkable. I uploaded it to the shared drive with a timestamp of 11:48 p.m., well before the Friday deadline. Then I did something that would later save me. I downloaded copies of everything. The report, the email chains, the access request logs, the file modification history. I saved it all to my personal laptop and a cloud drive Derek couldn't access. Friday morning, I sent Derek an email confirming submission and requesting a review meeting before Tuesday's presentation. He replied 6 hours later with a single line. "Received. Will review over the weekend." The message felt ominous, though I couldn't explain why. That weekend was torture. I kept checking my email, expecting feedback, questions, anything. Nothing came. Monday morning arrived with still no word from Derek. I tried to focus on other work, but my stomach stayed knotted with anxiety. At 3 p.m., my calendar pinged with a meeting invitation. Project review and leadership presentation. Tuesday 9 a.m. The attendee list made my blood run cold. Not just Derek and immediate team members. The VP of Operations. Director of Client Services. Senior partners. This wasn't a project review. This was a judgment. That evening, I opened the shared drive to review my report one final time before the presentation. My heart stopped. The file had been modified. At 7:23 p.m. on Sunday, someone had accessed my report. The modification timestamp showed changes made, but I was locked out from seeing what had changed. I immediately opened my personal copy, the one I downloaded Thursday night, and compared it to the version now in the shared drive. They were different. Numbers had been altered. Whole sections were missing. My carefully documented footnotes explaining limitations had been deleted. Error margins I'd included had been removed. The version in the shared drive made it look like I was presenting definitive conclusions from incomplete data. Like I'd been careless and overconfident instead of thorough and transparent. I checked the file history. The modifications came from Derek's account. He'd spent over 2 hours editing my work Sunday evening, then saved it without telling me. My hands shook as I took screenshots of everything. The modification log, the timestamp, the differences between versions. I saved multiple copies in multiple locations. Then I sat back and tried to think clearly through the panic. I could confront him now, but it would be his word against mine. I could refuse to present the altered version, but he'd already scheduled the meeting with senior leadership. Or I could let this play out. Let him present the sabotaged version, and then show everyone exactly what he'd done. That night I barely slept. I kept running through scenarios, trying to predict how the presentation would unfold. By 4 a.m. I gave up on sleep and started preparing. I created 2 presentation decks. One matched the sabotaged version in the shared drive, the version Derek expected me to defend. The other matched my original submission, complete with all my documentation, footnotes, and explanations. I organized my evidence chronologically. Every email request, every denial, every suspicious interaction. I prepared screenshots of the file modification history showing exactly when and how the report had been altered. If this was going to be a trial, I'd come armed with a complete defense. Tuesday morning arrived cold and gray. I dressed carefully, professionally. My hands were steady now. The panic had burned away, replaced by something clearer. Determination. The conference room was already half full when I arrived at 8:55. People I'd worked with for years, people I'd collaborated with, people who were about to watch what Derek thought would be my professional dismantling. I set up my laptop, connected to the projector, and waited. Derek arrived last, carrying his coffee with that same confident smile. The presentation started exactly as I'd feared. Derek took control immediately, not even asking if I wanted to present my own work. "Thank you all for joining," he began, his voice smooth and authoritative. "We're here to review Kelsey's market analysis project. As you know, this was a critical client deliverable with significant implications for our strategic direction." He pulled up the sabotaged version of my report. My stomach clenched, but I kept my face neutral. "Unfortunately," Derek continued, advancing to the first slide of metrics, "the results are concerning. The numbers showed completion rates at 32%. My actual completion rate had been 89%. Accuracy scores appeared catastrophically low. Mine had been meticulously calculated with appropriate confidence intervals." He walked through each failure point methodically, building a case that I'd been careless, rushed, unprofessional. Some people took notes. Others glanced at me with expressions ranging from disappointment to pity. One of the senior partners, a woman named Victoria Sterling, leaned forward with her arms crossed. She looked angry, but I couldn't tell if the anger was directed at me or the situation. Derek talked for 12 minutes straight, never once making eye contact with me. "Additionally," Derek said, clicking to another slide, "several key analyses are missing entirely. Competitor benchmarking is superficial at best. Market sizing lacks the depth we promised the client. Risk assessment is virtually non-existent. Each criticism was technically true of the sabotaged version, but none of it was true of what I'd actually submitted." He showed charts I'd never created, conclusions I'd never drawn, a version of my work that had been systematically dismantled to look incompetent. "The timeline was challenging, certainly," Derek continued, his tone shifting to that false sympathy I'd learned to hate. "But we've all delivered under pressure. That's what we do here. Unfortunately in this case." He paused dramatically. "The outcome falls entirely on her." The words hung in the air like a verdict. My face felt hot. My hands had gone cold again. I could feel 23 pairs of eyes on me, judging, evaluating, finding me lacking. Derek finally looked at me. His expression a perfect mask of disappointed leadership. "Kelsey, would you like to add anything?" This was my moment. The trap had sprung. Now I had to decide whether to stay caught or spring free. Took a breath. Then another. My voice, when it came, was quieter than I wanted but steady. "Yes," I said. "I'd like to respond." Derek gestured magnanimously, like he was granting me a favor. "Of course. Please." I stood up and walked to the laptop. My hand stayed steady as I disconnected Derek's presentation and connected mine. "What you just saw," I began, pulling up my first slide, "is not what I submitted." A ripple of confusion moved through the room. Derek's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The report I delivered on Thursday night at 11:48 p.m. looked very different from what was just presented. I pulled up the file modification history. 23 people leaned forward to read the timestamps. "This is the original submission." I clicked to show my actual report. "And this," another click, "shows modifications made to that submission on Sunday evening at 7:23 p.m. by someone who wasn't me." The room went very quiet. Victoria Sterling's expression shifted from anger to intense focus. "That's highly irregular," she said slowly. "Derek, can you explain this?" He recovered quickly. "Kelsey and I discussed some revisions," he said smoothly. "Standard editorial process." "We never discussed revisions," I said clearly. "I received no feedback between Thursday night's submission and this morning's presentation." I pulled up my email records, projected for everyone to see. "Here's my submission confirmation, sent Thursday at 11:52 p.m. Here's my request for a review meeting, sent Friday morning." Derek's only response: "Received. Will review over the weekend." I scrolled through the thread. No feedback. No revision request. No collaborative editing. Just this. I showed the modification log side by side with the email record. The timestamps told a damning story. Derek had edited my report Sunday evening without my knowledge or consent. "Standard editorial process involves communication," Victoria said, her voice sharp. "Was there any communication about these changes?" Derek shifted in his seat. "As team leader, I have discretion to make final edits to ensure quality." "That's not what I'm asking," Victoria pressed. "Did you inform Kelsey of any changes before this presentation?" The pause lasted too long. "I made the changes I felt were necessary to." "That's a no," Victoria interrupted. "You altered her work without her knowledge, then presented it as her failure." The power dynamic in the room had shifted. People were no longer looking at me with pity. "There's more," I said, and pulled up another document. The project had significant constraints from the beginning. I documented all of them. I showed the 14 access requests I'd sent over 3 weeks. Every single one with Derek's non-response or vague dismissal highlighted. I requested database permissions on day 3. Request denied. Requested competitor intelligence access. Denied. Requested client interview permissions. Denied. I scrolled through the evidence methodically. I found workarounds for everything, but those workarounds had limitations. I documented every single limitation in my original report. I pulled up my original submission, showing the extensive footnotes explaining exactly where data came from and why certain analyses were constrained. All of these explanations were removed in the Sunday evening edit. The version you just saw showed conclusions without context, making it appear I'd been careless rather than transparent about limitations. One of the directors, a man named Patrick Hughes, spoke up. "Derek, why would these footnotes be removed? They seem critical for understanding the report's scope." Derek's confidence was cracking. "They cluttered the presentation. Made it less readable." "They made it honest," I corrected. "They showed exactly what I could deliver given the resources I was provided." Victoria Sterling stood up, her chair scraping loudly. I think we need to pause this presentation. Derek, Kelsey, both of you stay here. Everyone else, please step out. The room cleared in under a minute. People left quickly, some with knowing looks, others seeming uncomfortable with the tension. Patrick Hughes stayed behind, closing the door after the last person left. Let me be very clear about something, Victoria said, her voice cold and precise. This company does not tolerate sabotage. If what Kelsey is showing us is accurate, Derek, you've not only undermined a team member but potentially damaged client relationships with falsified reporting. Derek tried to recover his authority. That's an exaggeration. I made editorial decisions about presentation format. You altered data, Patrick interrupted, pulling up the files on his own laptop. I'm looking at the modification log now. You changed numerical values. Removed entire analytical sections. Deleted documentation of constraints. He looked up at Derek with undisguised disgust. This isn't editorial discretion. This is falsification. Victoria turned to me. Kelsey, why didn't you report these access issues weeks ago? It was a fair question. I tried, I said. I documented everything in case it became necessary, but I didn't want to seem like I was making excuses or avoiding responsibility. Show me the original report, Victoria said. Everything you submitted Thursday night. I pulled up my personal copy, the complete version with all documentation, footnotes, and analysis intact. She and Patrick spent 15 minutes reading through it in silence. Derek sat frozen, his face pale. This is exceptional work, Victoria finally said. Given the constraints you faced, this is remarkably thorough. The methodology is sound, the conclusions are appropriately qualified, and the documentation is exemplary. He turned to Derek. You turned excellent work into apparent failure by removing the context that made it excellent. Why? He didn't answer. Couldn't answer. The truth was too ugly to speak aloud. Patrick closed his laptop. I've seen enough. Derek, consider yourself suspended pending a full investigation. We'll need to review every project you've supervised in the past 8 months. Derek stood abruptly. This is an overreaction. One editorial disagreement shouldn't. It's not an editorial disagreement, Victoria cut him off. It's sabotage. And if we find other instances, it's a pattern of misconduct that this company will not tolerate. She looked at me again. Kelsey, take the rest of today and tomorrow off. When you return, report directly to me. By Wednesday afternoon, word had spread throughout the office. Derek's calendar had been wiped clean. His office sat empty. People stopped by my desk, some to apologize for believing the presentation, others to share their own stories of strange interactions with Derek. Patterns emerged. 3 other team members had been given impossible projects with limited resources. 2 had left the company after being blamed for failures. 1 had filed a complaint with HR that had apparently gone nowhere. He always picked people he saw as threats, one colleague told me. People who were too good, who might make him look bad by comparison. The investigation moved quickly. HR pulled records, interviewed team members, reviewed project files. They found more altered reports, more sabotaged assignments, more instances of Derek setting people up to fail so he could take credit for saving clients afterward. By Friday, Derek's employment was terminated. No quiet resignation, no neutral announcement. The VP sent a company-wide email acknowledging that an unnamed manager had engaged in conduct inconsistent with our values, and was no longer with the firm. That weekend, I finally allowed myself to feel the full weight of what had happened. The fear, the anger, the vindication. I'd been targeted, set up to fail, publicly humiliated. But I'd also trusted my instincts, documented everything, and defended myself when it mattered. Monday morning I met with Victoria in her office. I want to apologize, she said immediately. The fact that Derek was able to operate this way for months without oversight is a leadership failure. We should have caught this sooner. I nodded, appreciating the acknowledgement. What happens now? Several things, Victoria said, pulling out a folder. First, you're being reassigned to a new team with a different manager, someone I trust completely. Second, your work on the market analysis project is being presented to the client as originally intended, with full credit to you. She slid a document across the desk. Third, we'd like to offer you a promotion to senior analyst with corresponding salary adjustment. Your work under impossible circumstances demonstrated exactly the kind of judgment and professionalism we need in leadership positions. The promotion was significant, both in title and compensation. I don't know what to say, I admitted. Say yes, Victoria replied with a slight smile. And say you'll help us develop better oversight processes so this never happens to anyone else again. I agreed to both. Over the following weeks, I worked with HR and leadership to create new protocols for project assignments, resource allocation, and management accountability. 3 months later, I was settling into my new role when Patrick Hughes stopped by my desk. Got a minute, he asked. The market analysis you did. The client was so impressed they've requested you specifically for a follow-up project. This one has proper timeline, full resources, and executive support. He paused. It's also worth noting that they told us if Derek had remained your supervisor, they were planning to end the contract. They could tell something was wrong in the original presentation. It was oddly satisfying to know my instincts had been right even beyond what I'd proven. The client had sensed the sabotage too. I'd be happy to take on the follow-up project, I said. That evening I updated my documentation files one final time. I'd kept everything. The emails, the screenshots, the file logs, the timeline of events. Not because I expected to need them again, but because they represented something important. They were proof that truth, when carefully documented, could survive even deliberate attempts to destroy it. I'd learned that speaking up felt terrifying in the moment but was necessary. That trusting your instincts mattered more than avoiding conflict. That sometimes the worst professional experience could become the catalyst for the best career development. A year later, I was leading my own team when a junior analyst came to my office looking worried. I think there might be a problem with a project I was assigned, she said hesitantly. The timeline seems off, and I'm having trouble getting resources approved. I recognized the pattern immediately. Tell me everything, I said. And make sure you're documenting all of it. She looked surprised. You think something's wrong. I think your instincts are telling you something, I replied. And I learned the hard way to trust those instincts. Let's review what you have and make sure you've got the support you need. We spent an hour going through her project, identifying legitimate constraints and potential red flags. It turned out her concerns were valid, and we addressed them before they became problems. As she left my office, I thought about Derek and that horrible Tuesday morning presentation. What he'd intended as my destruction had ultimately become my education. He'd taught me to document everything, to trust my judgment, to speak up even when my voice shook. Most importantly, he'd shown me exactly what kind of leader I never wanted to become. The kind who built themselves up by tearing others down. Success could be achieved through support, not sabotage. And truth, when given the chance, always found its voice.